Right, okay, everybody. I'm going to kick us off as we've 12:30. So good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our latest event to support general practice, particularly for those GPs who are thinking about retirement. For those of you who don't know me, my name is William. I'm the Chief Exec for Cheshire Local Medical Committee, and I'm joined today by Will from BW Healthcare, who are specialist surgery GP surveyors, and Will's going to be leading the session today. What I would ask you is, unless you are desperately eating your lunch, if you could turn your cameras on so that Will can see you, that'd be helpful. And if you would keep your microphones switched off to avoid any feedback, unless you're asking a direct question. So with that very brief introduction, I'm going to say that Will's going to take us through this session. If you've got a burning question, please ask it in the chat box or directly. Otherwise, we'll have a general Q&A at the end, so you might want to just make a note of any questions. And with that, I'll hand over to Will Ellis.
Hi there. Yes, thank you ever so much for that, William. So yes, as William has just explained, my name is Will Ellis. I work for a company called BW Healthcare Surveyors. So we assist practices with various premises related matters, and we're just going to be going through a presentation today with regards to succession and retirement planning, what to do with your premises. So if you just bear with me one moment, and I will bring that up. And then we can go through that. So as William said, there's a Q&A section in the top. So if you look on the top panel, there's a Q&A there. So if you've got any questions or queries for me, we can break out of the presentation if you want me to explain any particular part of it in more detail. But equally, if you can wait until the end, then we'll have a designated Q&A question and answer session at the end where we can go through the process. So hopefully you can all see that now. So you should see on your screens, welcome to Succession Retirement Planning, what to do with your premises. So what we're going to be talking about today, so we're going to be going through what to do with your premises, what your options are when it comes to succession and retirement planning. One of those options being sale and leaseback. So we're going to talk about sale and leaseback in a bit more detail, talk about the pros and the cons of sale and leaseback and how that process would work. An alternative option to that is putting a lease in place. So again, we'll talk about that process in a bit more detail. So in terms of rather than selling the premises to an investor, which is what sale and leaseback is, you effectively, when you as a GP retires, when the GP partners retires, putting a lease in place with yourselves as the landlord, as the investor, and leasing it back to the remaining GP partners as tenants. So we'll talk about that process as well. We'll talk about an alternative option, so transferring the NHS contracts to another entity. So if you don't want to run the practice anymore, or you're nearing retirement and you're struggling to find anybody to come in and replace you, then what organisations are there to come in and take over the contract and perhaps take over any lease liabilities as well. And then we'll have a little bit of a slide about how to maximise the value of your premises. So something slightly different, but in terms of perhaps in anticipation of selling the surgery, what steps you can take to ensure that you're getting the maximum amount of value out of the premises prior to sale. And then, like I said, what to do next. So just a quick Q&A at the end. Okay, so in terms of what the options are around your premises, so you have several options when deciding what to do with your premises upon retirement. So the first option that falls to everybody is trying to find new partners. So recruiting new GP partners, which I think is a bit of a nightmare at the moment. I know there's a lot of junior GPs who don't seem to be overly interested in buying into partnerships, but there are alternatives to GPs that you can recruit. So you can have nurse practitioners as GP partners, you can have practice managers as GP partners, even pharmacists as partners now as well. So there are alternatives there rather than just recruiting GPs if you are struggling to take on any new partners. And there are incentives that you can offer incoming partners as well. So one of the latest things is gradual buy-ins. So rather than a partner having to come in and buy in all in one go, they can just buy a percentage every year for a number of years until they reach their required amount. So if you've got a partner that needs to purchase 25% of the off a retiring partner, rather than buying that 25% in one go, they'd perhaps buy 5% every year for 5 years until they reach the required level. It just makes it a little bit more affordable and a bit more easier to find partners who might be interested in otherwise buying a share. The other option is sale and leaseback, as I've mentioned. So sale and leaseback is effectively where you would sell the surgery to an investor. An investor would come in, put a lease in place. You would still, as partners, retain or be tenants on the premises. You'd still hold the medical contracts, still provide medical services, but you just no longer own the premises. You'd be tenants in leasehold premises rather than owner occupied. Alternative to that is putting a lease in place, as I mentioned. So when a retired partner leaves, they would become the landlord, and they would just lease to the remaining partners. And then, as and when those remaining partners retire themselves, they take themselves off the tenancy, take themselves off the lease, and they would just become the landlords. And that allows, when you have a lease in place, it allows a bit of flexibility when incoming partners are coming in as well, because that incoming partner has a choice of either becoming an equity owning partner, where they would own a proportion of the premises, or just being a non-equity owning partner, where they're just signatories on the lease. So it just allows them, allows them to make the decision of buying into the partnership or just taking on the liability of the lease. It gives them a bit of choice from that point of view. Another option is merging with another local practice. So not something we're going to talk about in huge detail today. It's something that obviously the ICB can assist with. You're probably going to know a lot more than we do about what local surgeries might be interested in potentially merging with yourselves. But the idea from a retirement and succession point of view, how a merger will help is if you merge with a practice who have a younger set of partners, then obviously as and when your older set of partners retire, if you like, then the younger practice, younger set of partners can come in and take over the practice. So that is certainly an option that you can explore via the NHS, and also your local PCNs as well. Obviously, is a good place to start when it comes to practice mergers. Another option is transferring the contracts to another entity. So there are an awful lot of options. So PCNs, GP federations, third-party organisations can all hold contracts now. So if the issue upon retirement is that you're a single-handed partner and you're struggling to find anybody to take over the practice, and there's a worry that the practice might have to close, then there are specialist organisations who can come in and take over the practice, take over the contract to keep the surgery running. And the last option is for the surgery to close and sell up as alternative use. Obviously, this isn't an option that we want to think about. This is actually one of the main reasons why we've put this presentation together, is because we were having a number of conversations with practices who are having to unfortunately close their doors, and a lot of them weren't aware of what their options are when it comes to potentially transferring the contracts to another entity, or sale and lease back, or putting leases in place and things like that. So we've just put this presentation together to hopefully avoid that option of having to close the surgery and disperse the patients to other practices. Hopefully you'll get some ideas and options to help you avoid that choice. Okay, so they're the kind of main options when it comes to what to do with your premises. So we're going to concentrate on two of these options: sale and leaseback and putting a lease in place. So sale and leaseback first. Some of the benefits of sale and leaseback to think about, and certainly some of the reasons why practices decide to go down a sale and leaseback route. One of the first things to be aware of is that the lease rent will be fully reimbursed by the NHS. So whatever rent you pay, the landlord is going to get fully reimbursed by the NHS, and that'll be for the duration of the lease. So if you sign a 15-year lease, for the 15-year period, your whatever rent you pay the landlord, even when the landlord increases the rent at rent reviews, you should have protection within the lease to ensure that the NHS are going to fully reimburse you up to that level. Now, you may have heard of horror stories where that isn't the case, where practices are paying 10, 20, 30% more to their landlord than what they're receiving. But the main reason for that is because they didn't get correct representation through surveyors like ourselves or solicitors to assist them through the process. So as long as you get the correct representation, we will ensure that you have the correct protections in the lease and correct clauses in the lease, which will effectively say, and the rent that you pay the landlord will not exceed what you receive from the NHS. So you'll have the necessary protections in the lease. Going through a sale and leaseback as well as another point can also reduce the perceived risk and responsibility of property ownership. So under a standard commercial lease, the landlord would take on the responsibility of the external repair and maintenance of the premises. So Under those circumstances, you would no longer have to worry about the external repair and maintenance of the premises. Now, what sometimes happens with primary care leases is the landlords don't want that responsibility either. So they actually try and bat that back to you as the tenants, to the GP practice as the tenants. Now, if that does happen, then you can actually retain a proportion of the rent that you pay or that you receive from the NHS. So rather than paying the rent in full to the landlord, you can hold back somewhere between 5 and 7.5% of the rent to fund effectively the external repair and maintenance of the premises. So the idea is you put that into a sinking fund and use that money for any repairs that are needed for the external part of the building. So either A, the landlord's going to take on the responsibility of the external repair, so you don't have to worry about it anymore, or B, you will still be responsible for it, but you'll have that money stored away, that 5 to 7.5% of the rent stored away to fund, hopefully fund any future repairs. Number 3, so it can remove the burden of ongoing capital investment. So ultimately, because when you sell the surgery, an investor's going to come in, they're going to own the premises, it's going to be up to them. It's going to be their responsibility to fund any extensions, improvements, and upgrades to the premises, just simply because it's not your premises anymore. It can also help attract new GP partners. So the idea is that when you're in a leasehold premises, it is slightly more attractive for incoming partners to come in and join the partnership, mainly because they're not having to find what is often hundreds of thousands of pounds for a small share of the premises. They're just having to ultimately sign a lease document and be signatories on the lease. So it is seen as a little bit more attractive for incoming partners. It's not a magic wand. There are still issues when you're in a leasehold premises. There are still liabilities for that partner to consider. So it's not like you've got thousands of partners just waiting for you to become a leasehold premises so they can come and join the team, but it is just seen as a little bit more attractive when you're in a leasehold rather than in an owner occupied practice. Number 5, so having a lease in place will generally create a higher premium value of the premises of the property than owner occupied. So when we value practices as surveyors, one of the things we will take into consideration is any assigned lease to the premises. So when we are valuing a practice for a partnership change in an owner-occupied premises, effectively there's no lease in place. So ultimately, that practice could close at any point. That rental income could stop at any point. When you go through a sale and leaseback, when you've got an assigned lease in place, you've got that security of that lease, that guarantee of that lease. So if you're signing a 15-year lease, effectively what that lease is saying is that rent is going to be paid and reimbursed for that 15-year period. So it just gives a bit of security to a potential investor, and therefore a little bit of a premium is added to the potential value that it would have been assigned if it was just an owner-occupied premises. So one of the two major factors when determining value of GP practices, the first one being the rental income, so the notional rent that is paid and received by the practice, and any other rental incomes from pharmacies and other tenants that pay a rent. So it's the rental income as one, and the second is the length of the lease. So the longer that lease is, the higher the value of the premises is. So certainly something to consider if you were to go through a sale and leaseback is the longer you can agree to sign up to, the higher the value of the premises when you come to sell. Number 6, so it can also assist with improvement works, extensions, or even new developments of GP premises. So I would say this is one of the big reasons why practices go through a sale and leaseback, is because they are running out of space, like everybody seems to be at the moment, or they are in need of upgrades, improvements, in modernization. They might even need obviously extensions, or even perhaps they're contemplating relocating to a new development, but they've tried to fund it themselves. They've tried to seek assistance from the NHS to help them part fund it, and they've just hit brick walls. So getting an external investor in can be a great option, because they can come in and as part of that process, they would purchase the existing site, but then agree to perhaps spend X amount of money extending the existing site, or upgrading and improving the existing site, or even assisting in relocating to a new premises as well. So getting an external investor in can certainly be a benefit to those if you're a practice in that situation, if you're a practice in need of an upgrade or running out of space. Number 7, and the last point, in most cases, the tenant will be protected, will have protected rights for a new lease upon expiry of the lease. So under the Landlord and Tenants Act, when the lease expires, if you were to sign a 15-year lease under a sale and leaseback, when that lease expires, then you can you can renew, automatically renew for another 15 years. So it has to be under the same terms as the initial lease, but you'll have that automatic right to renew upon expiry. Effectively, it makes it very difficult for the landlord to just sign you up to a 15-year lease and then kick you out upon expiry and get another tenant in. It gives you some protected rights to avoid that. Okay, so they're the kind of main upsides of sale and leaseback. Some of the downsides, or certainly some of the things you're going to need to consider before you go through the process. So leases can restrict what you as tenants do to the surgery. So again, because it's not your premises, if you did want to make any upgrades or changes or extend the surgery, you're going to have to ask the landlord's permission to do that, because ultimately it's their premises. It's their decision whether they're wanting to make those changes to the premises. You may also have specific obligations on the practice in the lease. So the lease may state things like you have to redecorate the surgery every 3 to 5 years. There will certainly be a clause in the lease that says you have to keep the surgery in its current state of repair. So whatever the state of repair is on day one of the lease has to be the state of repair at the end of the lease. Otherwise, you could just face financial penalties. Effectively, you'll have to pay to bring the surgery back up to its original state. So it's just being aware of what your obligations are within the lease. There will also be liabilities under the lease, including rental payments. So one of the things to consider when you are determining what the length of the lease is what you're willing to sign is, yes, there's a benefit to signing a long-term lease because you're going to increase the value of the premises, increase your return of investment when you decide to sell the premises. Now, the downside to signing a long-term lease is you are extending your liabilities. So although the NHS are agreeing to reimburse you for any rent under the lease, that is only on the proviso that you continue to provide medical services, you continue to run as a GP practice, continue to hold the GMS contract. If that were to stop for any reason, so if you couldn't recruit new partners and partners are wanting to retire and you were having to close the surgery down, if you had years left to run on the lease, you're going to have to make the payments, and you'll have penalties in terms of making those rental payments for the duration of the lease. So it's just worth considering. If there's any reason why you don't believe the practice is going to be here in 10, 15 or 20 years, then it's probably contemplating perhaps signing a shorter term lease, or even getting break clauses inserted into the lease, which will effectively allow you to break the lease if the surgery were to ever close. So like an Armageddon clause, for example. So if the surgery were to ever close, if you ever to stop providing medical services, then you could exit the lease without penalty. So you can avoid those potential penalties and potential pitfalls, but it does have a downside adding break clauses, because it's going to have a detrimental effect on the value of the premises. So it's just weighing up when it comes to the lease length and the break clauses. It's weighing up the benefit in the extra income, the extra value of the premises, the downside being the liabilities that come alongside that. So it's just a discussion needed to have between the parties. Something else to consider when you go through a sale and leaseback is your early redemption penalties. So the penalties for paying off your mortgage early. So if you're stuck into a contract with your mortgage provider, because you're selling the surgery, you're going to have to pay the mortgage off, and quite often they will charge you for their loss of interest effectively for the remaining term of that mortgage. So it's just worthwhile speaking to your mortgage provider, finding out what those early redemption penalties are. They can sometimes be astronomical. Aviva, for example, are renowned for their astronomical early redemption penalties. So if you have a mortgage with Aviva, it is certainly worth speaking to them. But whoever it's with, just pick up the phone, find out what those early redemption penalties are, make sure they're not too large, and it's not going to scupper any sale and lease back. Number 5, so you must have at least 2 signatures on the lease at all times. So if you are a single-handed practice, you're going to have to find another partner to come in and work alongside you, be a signatory on the lease alongside you before you go through a sale and leaseback process. If there's multiple partners, so effectively if you're in a practice with 5 or 6 partners, so let's say 5 partners, all 5 are happy to sign the lease. Technically, the first 3 can leave and exit without having to find anybody to replace them on the lease. When you get down to those last 2, the second to last partner that leaves is going to have to find somebody to replace them on the lease, or effectively they're going to remain liable for the terms of the lease. So that's worth considering as well. But certainly if you're a single-handed practice, you're going to have to do something about getting another partner in, or somebody else to sign up to that lease. And one of those options would be a third-party organisation, which we'll go through in a minute when we talk about transferring the contracts to another entity. Number 6, so your potential tax implications. So you will have tax implications when you sell the surgery and when you put a lease in place, so capital gains tax and stamp duty, land tax. So it's worthwhile getting specialist advice from an accountant just to find out what those liabilities are. So just speak to your accountant and ask them what the tax liabilities, tax implications are for selling the surgery and putting a lease in place. Okay, so in terms of the process, so if you're generally interested in a sale and leaseback, the first thing that would happen is you'd get a specialist surveyor to come out and value the premises, give you an idea of what the surgery is worth on the open market. That surveyor would then have a discussion with the existing partners to what sort of terms they would be happy with to sign up to, so the length of lease that they're happy to sign up to, what repair obligations that they want, whether they want to insert any break clauses that we've just talked about. Once that's all been agreed, those lease terms then go to the NHS for approval, and once it's all been approved, then it's a case of going to market and negotiating with any interested parties to get you the best possible deal. But any surveyor that you employ to assist you with that process will manage everything from start to finish to take away you having to worry about anything at all. Okay, so that's kind of sale and leaseback. If you do have any questions specifically around sale and leaseback, feel free to pop them in the Q&A tab at the top, and we can go through those at the end. But moving on to another option in putting a lease in place. So when you put a lease in place, so this is an option around, rather than selling the surgery, perhaps you're nearing retirement, but you don't want to sell the surgery. You want to retain the asset. You're quite happy with the income that you receive via the rental payments and things, and you're happy to keep hold of that asset during your retirement. That's absolutely fine. So rather than selling the surgery to an investor, to a third party, you would effectively become the investor yourself. You would become the landlord yourself. So you can talk about putting a lease in place. So you would be the landlord of the premises along with the other owner occupiers, the other equity owning partners, and you would lease it to the remaining equity owning partners who are staying at the practice and still providing medical services. And then as and when they leave, they become the landlords and just lease it to the remaining parties, etc. Now, there are things you need to consider when you're putting a lease in place between the two parties. One of the big things to be aware of is it can be very tempting sometimes to put favourable terms when you're agreeing it between parties, when you're agreeing it between connected parties effectively, because you've worked together for so long, you've no doubt friends with a lot of the other partners as well. So it can be very tempting to put favourable terms in there. So perhaps just a 12-month rolling lease, or perhaps allowing break clauses every 12 months, etc. It's worthwhile just considering the detrimental effect these clauses and these lengths of lease have on the value of the premises. So although you're very happy to be the landlord now, circumstances can change, and you might decide in 5-10 years' time that actually you do want to sell the surgery. Now, that's going to be very difficult if you've just got a 12-month rolling lease. So it is just worth considering if you do decide to go down the route of putting a lease in place, that it is a marketable lease, and you just consider the capital value of that lease when it's in place. So it's just ensuring really that you get the correct representation to assist you through the process, to make sure that you're not inserting any lease terms that are going to have a detrimental effect on the value of the premises further down the line. And some of the other things to consider. So it's very, very important that you get a specific NHS GP surgery lease. So we have seen far too many just standard commercial leases in the past. Now, the issue with a standard commercial lease is it is just between two entities. You've got the landlord, you've got the tenant, which is the case in 99% of commercial entities. Now, primary care is very, very different because you have a third party involved, you've got the NHS involved, and they have to be documented very clearly, their role in the process, specifically around rent reviews. So it has to be very clear that the rent review is undertaken by the landlord, but then approved and ratified by the NHS. Now, if that isn't documented within the lease, technically the landlord could increase the rent without you having any guarantee that that's going to be fully reimbursed by the NHS. So it's just very, very important that any lease in place is a specific primary care surgery lease. It's also very important that that lease is approved and ratified by the district valuer and the NHS. Again, that's to ensure and protect you as tenants, to make sure that that rent is fully reimbursed. Whatever rent you pay the landlord, make sure that is fully reimbursed by the NHS. It's also very important to clearly state the landlord and the tenant's responsibilities, which is effectively the whole purpose of a lease, is to avoid any future disputes and arguments further down the line. So if you can document that as clearly as possible, then that's going to avoid any issues in the future. Also, when you put a lease in place, it may affect your mortgage on the premises. So there may be conditions and restrictions on your mortgage that state that the surgery has to remain as an owner-occupied premises. So it's just worthwhile speaking to your mortgage provider again to make sure that you don't have any restrictions or conditions on the mortgage to prevent you from becoming a leasehold premises. Also, again, tax implications, always worthwhile speaking to your accountant to find out what the tax implications are of putting a lease in place. Okay, so transferring the contracts to another entity. So perhaps you want to sell the surgery to a third party, or perhaps you've retired and you want to become the landlord, but there's nobody that's in there holding the contract. There's nobody there to keep running the practice. So there are several options. There are several organisations who could potentially assist with that process. So you could explore the possibility of your local PCN or GP federation taking over the contract and becoming leaseholders. You could also have a look at a similar local surgery via a practice merger, which is what we've talked about before earlier in the presentation, merging with a local practice and getting them to take over the contract and take over any lease liabilities. There are also several third-party organisations these days. They seem to be popping up all over the place, who basically specialise in taking over contracts for failing and struggling surgeries who might be facing closure due to retirement of their GPs. So companies like Operos, who you may have heard of, or E. Harley Street, GP Consultancy Alliance, all these organisations could look at coming in, taking over the contract. We are working with a number of practices who are not just selling their surgery and going through a sale and leaseback, but simultaneously transferring the contracts to another entity. So the GPs, the partners at that particular practice, not only do they not want to own the surgery, they don't want the hassle of running the practice either. So they're actually just calling it a day completely. A couple of the partners are actually becoming salaried and locum GPs, so still working at the practice, but just with zero responsibility and zero stress. So just taking away the partnership and selling the surgery. So there are certainly options out there, and there, like I said, there are plenty of third-party organisations. Employee-owned trusts now is a possibility. So rather than the partnership holding the contract, you could set up an employee-owned trust, similar to the way organisations in the private sector work. So rather than just the partners owning equity in the premises, it could be all employees, so all admin staff, nurses, etc., and any staff could own a proportion of the premises and set it up as an employee-owned trust to hold the contract and be leaseholders. And then last resort is the NHS. So the NHS will, if it means as an alternative to closing the surgery, will sometimes take over the contract and take over the lease liabilities. It is seen as a last resort in most areas, and they will probably much rather you look at exploring these other options first, but failing those, then the NHS may decide that they would want to take over the surgery rather than see it close. Okay, last slide. So how to maximise the value of the premises. So in anticipation of perhaps selling the surgery, if you were to go down a sale and leaseback, there are steps you can take to make sure you're maximising the value of the premises. One of the first things to consider is to get your notional rent checked by an independent surveyor. Now, this should probably be something you're doing anyway. I would certainly recommend that you get that checked every 3 years to make sure the rent is in line with the current market, make sure you're not getting underfunded. But certainly prior to selling the surgery, it has never been more important, because even increasing the notional rent by as little as £1,000 can increase the value of the premises by up to 10, 15, even £20,000. It can have a huge knock-on effect to the value of the premises. Also, it's to ensure any lease agreements and rental amounts are up to date. So if you rent any space out to a pharmacy or a dentist, it's just making sure that those leases haven't expired, making sure you tie them up to long-term leases, making sure any outstanding rent reviews are undertaken and their rent is up to date as well. And if you do have any spare space, which is always where everybody seems to laugh, I don't think anybody has any spare space, but if you manage to magic some spare space from somewhere, it's just ensuring that that space, if you are using it for GMS purposes, that is fully reimbursed. You're receiving notional rent for it, and if you're not, perhaps look at renting it out to alternative therapists or pharmacy, etc., to try and maximize the value of the rental income. And then the last thing is upgrades, improvements, and exploring potential extensions to the premises as well. So like I said, these are things that potentially incoming investors might contemplate assisting you with. But if you can do that yourselves, if you can upgrade and improve the surgery or extend the surgery prior to going to sale, prior to going to market, then it can increase the value of the premises, increase your return on investment effectively. Okay, so that is just about it from me. So whatever you decide to do next, it is imperative that you receive correct advice from specialist surveyors like ourselves, but also accountants and solicitors, just to ensure that you make the right decision for the partnership, the practice, and the patients. There's plenty of free advice you can get out there. We certainly are available 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, pretty much, it seems at times, but you can certainly contact us during those times, either over the phone or over email if you've got any questions or queries. If you want to discuss your specific circumstances, then we can certainly have a look at assisting you through that. Okay, so look, we'll go over to the Q&As. I think I saw a question around the NHS Trust, but it seems to have disappeared. Let me just have a quick look if I can bring that up. Okay, so let me just have a quick look here.
I mean, just on foundation trusts.
Yes. Okay,
well,
please go. Yeah.
Although my background is about 30 odd years on GP contracts, etc.,
Yeah.
I did at one time run the foundation trust approval program for the northwest of England.
Okay.
And so what I want to just flag up to colleagues there is the difference between an NHS trust and a foundation trust. Foundation trusts quite often are seen as a go-to place for potentially taking over GP contracts. There are implications though, because to become a foundation trust, you in fact get a license to do that from the NHS, and the regulators require you to provide various business and financial plans, etc. So taking over a GP practice, in effect, is not your core business. So you need to amend your license with the NHS, and a lot of FTs aren't willing to do that. It's too big a risk. So I just wanted to flag that up as an issue.
No, really appreciate that. Actually, I wasn't aware of that, to be honest with you, William. So no, that's really useful.
You are right to say that there are many third parties. We have a number of practices in Cheshire that, in effect, if you want to call it that, are run by a third party. So yep. People like SSP Healthcare, which is originally from Wigan, they've got a couple of practices.
Yep.
We've seen 1 or 2 GPs from outside Cheshire take over practices as well. I wouldn't say any of the practices we've got in Cheshire are failing. It's just we've got GPs come to retirement age and have not been able to recruit new partners.
Yeah.
So we've helped them. We've helped them with that and provided advice and done some of the introductions, etc. And the other thing is to look at models. You mentioned Oprah Rose. Is someone like Our Health Partnerships down in Birmingham.
Yeah.
Which operate right on our borders because they cover Shropshire now as well. So there are alternatives out there. I think your core advice, however, is relevant whatever route you go down. You need to involve the local NHS, be it NHS England or more likely the ICS, at an early stage, because what you always have to remember is that the cost directions, which are the rules governing premises, require you to get the NHS's permission to significant changes. Otherwise, you risk the fact they could turn around to you and say, we don't accept that for rent and rate purposes. So you can go away and do it, but you're not getting the money for it. So that's the important element of this, engagement with whoever, which will be the ICS at the moment locally here, to any potential change. So if you, for example, got a dentist working from your practice and they leave and you take over the premises, get NHS involved early doors. Don't just think it's an automatic approval.
No, I mean, that's a very, very good point, William. And we see that all the time, actually. And it can get quite frustrating, really. But yeah, it is absolutely imperative that any changes to the use of rooms is Yeah, you do inform the NHS, and it's actually, unfortunately, it is at the NHS's discretion as to whether they decide to reimburse you. So even when you inform them, it's still not guaranteed that they will reimburse you, but still it is very, very important that you inform them as early as possible. And actually the cost directions do make it very difficult to retrospectively seek approval. So it is actually in your best interest to ensure that you do that even before any changes are made. So yeah, very, very important that you get that approval. And the same with things like extensions. We've seen it a number of times when practices build an extension and they actually seek approval for that extension from the ICB or the NHS or the PCT, the CCG at the time, and they'll get approval to build, but that you need to then seek separate approval for reimbursement for that extension as well. So just because they've agreed that you can build this extension doesn't necessarily mean they are agreeing to reimburse you notional rent for that part of the building. So very important that you get a double approval, if you like. One, to actually build the extension and make the improvements, but two, to actually seek approval for notional rent for those changes as well. Very, very important. Okay, so
question from Melanie as
yes,
well in the box
there is.
down there.
Absolutely. I've just seen that as well. Yes, just with regards independent surveyors, just to ensure that it's checked. So yeah, it looks here that it's with regards to the cost. So it looks like you've been quoted pretty much the first year by the sounds of it. So the full first year of any increase, which I would say is quite standard across the industry. I mean, we personally charge a little bit less than that. We're only 85%, but it's not a huge amount. I would say that it's relatively common, that it's always on a performance related basis, and the majority of companies do charge a performance related basis. So we'd only charge if successful in getting you an increase. So effectively, if we come out and are unable to get you an increase, then yeah, we wouldn't charge anything at all. But I would say that is a relatively common charge. Yes.
Just while we're waiting for any more questions as well, Will.
Yes.
One thing I often get asked is, how, and I know the answer to this, how soon should I start planning for my retirement for things like this? What's your advice?
Well, I mean, I would say at least 12 months before, at the very least. I mean, it's certainly for things like putting a lease in place and sale and lease back. These processes aren't quick. You know, certainly not sale and lease back. I mean, that process, we often advise it's going to take between 6 and 12 months to go through a sale and leaseback process, get everything sorted out. So yeah, the sooner the better. But I would say at least 12 months. Certainly 12 months would give you plenty of time to, from a premises point of view. Obviously, the other aspects that you need to consider that are fall outside of our remit, you'll probably know a lot more about, William. But from a premises point of view, I would say at least 12 months.
Yeah, and I'd agree with you. I mean, I usually advise my GPs that 12 to 18 months in terms of premises, pension, talking to your specialist tax advisors about making it tax efficient and when to finish. So all those things, and the delays at the pensions agency because of Primary Care Support England's involvement in this, certainly 12 to 18 months. So it's not a thing to think of at the last minute. The other thing I would say, and I suppose you see this as well, Will, is that given the state of the GP contract at the moment and the push by NHS England and others to aggregate up, so in other words, more and more money goes through PCNs, or the new money goes through PCNs and practices, which we don't think is appropriate, but however, is about engaging with your PCN in this process. Because as you know, ICSs have asked all PCNs to do estate strategies and clinical strategies and workforce strategies. So there are issues here about if you do decide to do something with your premises, the ICS may well be approaching your PCN for a view on what you're thinking of doing and does it fit in with PCN plans. And of course, individual practices might have a different view. So have you got any experience of that, Will, or is that something you see often now?
I can't say we've had specific experience of that, William, to be honest with you, no. But I mean, I would certainly echo that it's worth involving as many parties as possible through the decision-making process. So yes, certainly having conversations with the PCN leads, the ICS, but also if you've got a retained surveyor, getting advice from your retained surveyor, your accountant, your solicitors, just getting as much advice through the process, and the options that are open to you. Obviously, we've gone through and we've touched on some of the options that are available to you today, but it's worthwhile getting other opinions on these options. This is just, you know, almost our take and our perception on the decisions. But yeah, the plenty of advice you can get out there from organisations. So yeah, certainly worth absolutely involving the ICS from an early stage, because they can probably assist you through the process as well. But yeah, obviously the PCN, and then organisations like ourselves more than happy to help as well.
And again, I suppose in your experience, what would be your doomsday scenario, your worst case scenario that you have to deal with, where colleagues perhaps don't plan far enough in advance for their retirement on premises?
I mean, I think it's the what we touched on earlier is I mean, we had a client down in Cornwall, who unfortunately we'd contacted them to assist with their notional rent actually, and the reply was, well, we're not having a notional rent review because we're closing our doors in the next 2 months. So I gave her a call to say, look, what's going on here? And she said, look, the partner was leaving, a couple of partners were retiring, and they just couldn't find any incoming partners to take over. So they'd handed in their notice, effectively given, I think it's 6 months notice they gave to the NHS to close their doors, and then the surgery was dispersing. And as it transpired, as we were talking further, it turned out that they hadn't actually explored some of the options that we've talked about today. So one of the options I mentioned to her was the option of potentially looking at transferring the contracts to another entity, which effectively would have kept the surgery open. And what she said was even the ICB, or it was the CCG at the time, that didn't advise that was an option, which was quite surprising from my point of view, that some of these options aren't even being made available by the CCG or by the ICSs now. So it's why, like I said, why we've kind of put this presentation together, to hopefully avoid scenarios like that happening, because it was too late to help them. They were too far down the line, and there was a decision had already been made that they were closing their doors and their patients were being dispersed. But I generally believe that if they'd come to us 6-12 months earlier, that we could have probably assisted them and kept that surgery open by some of the options that we talked about. So yeah, I think it's just, yeah, even if it's in the back of your mind, if you're not sure, you're struggling to recruit new GP partners, you're not sure, even if you're 2-3 years away, it's certainly worthwhile having a conversation and trying to put things in place to avoid the last resort, which is obviously closing the surgery down.
And I don't want to dominate the questions, which I seem to be doing, but as there's nobody else sort of engaging, I have seen this obviously in different roles that I've had across the Northwest, etc. You spent some time talking about sale and leaseback,
Yeah.
which is something I'm familiar with, but perhaps a number of colleagues aren't. And one of the things that we find a lot of when we run our new to practice for our new GPs, our younger GPs, is the lack of understanding about premises. All they think about it is it's a millstone, it's a big cost to them at an early stage in their career. And I think you've mapped out the sort of key pros and cons of that, which I think is very useful. And I'd recommend colleagues go away and revisit that.
Yeah.
I mean, certainly, again, in your experience, are you seeing more or a leveling off of sale and leaseback as people try and get rid of that extra concern that might mean they could encourage new partners to come in because they haven't got that to think of?
I would say we are seeing a huge uptake in sale and leaseback at the moment, to be honest with you. There seems to be, yeah, issues nationwide with recruitment. It tends to be down to lack of recruitment, recruiting new partners, which tends to be the reason why practices go through sale and leaseback. Also, potentially lack of investment in their premises, needing upgrades and improvements and things is another reason. But yeah, I would say there's more practices than ever who are wanting to go through the process. The downside is, or on the flip side, rather than a downside, I suppose, is the market is a strange market at the moment. So although there are an awful lot of practices wanting to go through a sale and leaseback, there aren't as many investors wanting to actually buy into primary care at the moment. So that is certainly an issue. It is a strange market with the rising cost of mortgages and interest rates and things. There are a lot of investors who are taking a bit of a step out of the market at the moment. So yeah, there's probably a bit of a backup of potential sales coming to market compared to how many investors are out there. But once the market picks up, yeah, I think I would say from our point of view, on one hand, it's great because obviously one of our core services is providing sale and leaseback. But from a patient at a practice point of view, and for the wider NHS, it is a worrying time. It is a worrying time that so many practices are going through the process, and yeah, it's just one of those things. But I guess the main thing is that the surgeries are staying open, are still providing medical services. That is the main thing. The main benefit of sale and leaseback is avoiding these surgeries closing down and patients having to be dispersed, which certainly isn't what we want to see.
Is it worth also, do you think, Will, just mentioning, because not everybody is familiar with the premises cost directions, and of course these are the rules, if you like, that cover GP reimbursement for premises.
Yeah.
They are woefully out of date. I think they should have been updated about 5 or 6 years ago.
Yep.
And we keep being told they're coming out tomorrow, but they
Yep.
never do. So I would suggest to people who, apart from getting your professional advice, which I'd always advise them go to a specialist medical surveyor for this sort of advice, but it doesn't do any harm to look at the cost at the premises directions. So often I'm brought in at the 11th hour where people have done something silly like taken over some vacated property, kitted it out, and wonder why they're not getting rent and rates reimbursement for it, etc. I think the point you made earlier on, you've got to consider a lease as a triangle. So you've got the landlord and the tenant, which is what most people would see, but you have to remember the role of the NHS in this. They have to agree the lease as well, that it's reasonable. And if they don't, then you could have reimbursement issues. And again, that's why you need a specialist healthcare medical surveyors involved in that, because you can help negotiate that through.
No, absolutely. Yeah, no, it is. That is very, very important. Yeah, it can't be stressed enough, to be honest with you, to get. It can be very, very tempting sometimes to just get a cheap lease off the internet and get everything signed. But although it seems like the cheap option, that is a short-term fix, because the long-term effect of that can be catastrophic. To be honest with you, we've seen some awful leases whereby the tenants are paying 20, 30, 40% more to the landlords. We've actually seen a few these days in practices with RPI increases, so annual increases in rent, which at the moment, at the current state of RPI, which is close to 10%, is just ridiculous. And obviously, if that lease hasn't been approved by the NHS, then the NHS aren't going to be reimbursing that rent either. So that it really is so important, one, to get professional advice. Absolutely get professional advice, but at least get the lease approved. If you don't go in to get professional advice, which I would never advise, but if you did decide against it, just at least get that lease approved by the NHS, get it approved and get them to check to make sure you're not signing anything untoward, make sure you've got all the necessary protections in place. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, from our point of view, although we can't draft the heads of terms free of charge, if you've got some heads of terms, we can assess them for you free of charge. So we can do a free heads of terms check to make sure you have the necessary protections in there, the necessary clauses, and then we can potentially look at quoting you for assisting you further down the line as well. So like I said, there's plenty of free advice, free services out there to make the most of, even before having to put your hands in your pocket. But yeah, certainly important getting the ICS and the NHS involved in every decision that you make to do with the premises.
Well, there's an offer of free advice, which you should always bite off the hand that offers that. Has anybody else got any questions for Will? Any burning questions? Anything you're not sure of what Will said, or you just want to clarify anything with him while we've got him? Somebody might be typing something at the moment.
I think, yeah, it looks like Sarah is. But just on that point, just while we're waiting for Sarah's question, is if it's not something that you don't have any questions right now, my obviously contact details are there. If you want to have a specific discussion about your unique circumstances, then by all means just give me a call or drop me an email at any point. More than happy to have a one-on-one chat with you further down the line, either whether it's tomorrow or in 2 years time. The offer is there. We're always there to help and advise where we can, so by all means get in touch if needed.
Got Sarah's question now. So where is it best to get advice about transferring to third party?
I mean, I can probably recommend some companies for you to have a conversation with, Sarah. So, I mean, if you want to, I'll try. I don't know if William, if you've got Sarah's email, but I'll maybe. In fact, what I'll do is I'll pass the contact details on to William of some third parties who might be able to assist you. So there's a company called E Harley Street, and then there's another company as well called there's Operos and there's GP Consultancy Alliance. So it's probably worth having a conversation with the companies directly, and they will talk you through how the process works, how they can help. And I'd probably recommend talking to 2 or 3 of them, really, just to get a bit of a vague idea. Although they all do the same thing, they'll offer slightly different services. You might prefer one organisation over another. It's important that you obviously have a relationship with the company that you're going to take over, and that you trust the company that they're going to take over as well. So I can certainly provide the contact details of a couple of organisations who's probably worth having a conversation with. And then, yeah, I'm more than happy to have a conversation with you as well about other options that might be available to you.
Yeah, and just for Sarah's benefit, I mean, I've helped a number of practices pass their contract, if you like, to somebody else. We won't, as an LMC, we won't recommend anybody to you, but as Will said, we will give you 2 or 3 names that we know are interested in moving into the Cheshire area or already have done so. We'll give you the contact details. As Will said, I would advise talking to 2 or 3 and see who you feel more at ease with and what their offers are. But again, it is worth doing that well in advance before you get too far. And I would also, again, have a word with the primary care team at the ICS about this, if that's an issue, because they can help you steer through it. In particular, they'll tell you what not to do, because as I say, they have to agree things as well. So getting them on board at an early stage is good practice. Okay, I'm just looking at the various chat box and the Q&A. I'm not seeing any more questions for Will. As Will's kindly said, I'm sure he'll share the slides, etc. And we've got his contact details there. Or I'm happy to pass comments or questions to him if you wish me to do so. And I'm sure, as he said earlier on, that he's willing to give some free advice if you want to contact him as well. If there's nothing else, I'm just looking through. I'm going to thank everybody for their time in joining us. Hope you've got something from the session. I thought Will was very clear with his slides about what the key issues are for you, what actions you can take to protect yourselves, and hopefully make it a successful option for you as you move forward with your plans. But thanks again for your time. Any final questions, just put them to us by email and we'll try and get back to you. And I'll thank Will for his time and for the presentation today. Thank you all.
Yep, thank you for that. Yes, I'd just like to echo that from William as well. Thank you all for joining. Hope you found it useful. And yeah, any other questions, let us know. And thank you for organising it all as well, William. Much appreciated.